Good morning. Today I'm carrying on really from yesterday, um, talking about what is God doing in the current crisis. In particular, thinking about why there is no special word from God for these unusual circumstances that we find ourselves in. Over the last few weeks, I suppose you could say I've been passing on various bits of standard biblical advice on coping with pestilence. The point I want to make today is quite simple. We don't need a special word from God because, contrary to what we might think, we are not living in special times. And I'll explain what I mean by that later on. I want to begin by a little meditation on Romans 1:18. When the Apostle Paul is trying to lay out his gospel and his gospel purposes to the Roman Christians, he writes this great letter to the Romans. And after saying that the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel, he says there's also another revelation of the wrath of God. He simply says this: the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness. And he doesn't explain that. He doesn't explain how we see that revelation of God's wrath. And I think he doesn't explain it because to most people that's fairly obvious. We do live in a life which is full of trouble. The old idea that this world is a vale of tears isn't the whole truth, but it's certainly a large part of the truth. The wrath of God is being revealed against all unrighteousness. But I think sometimes Christian believers have forgotten that. They have forgotten that our experience is a revelation of God's wrath. Psalm 90 is the psalm which I think says this most clearly. That I'll read a few verses from verse 7. We are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures. Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. Now this psalm is not a depressive psalm. It's not a psalm of self-flagellation. It's simply an observation. We live in times of trouble. And trouble is normal. I think I've made this point in one of my previous talks, so I won't labour it. But it's sometimes worth just reminding ourselves that Psalm 90 is right. That's the world we live in. And New Testament Christianity doesn't contradict the Old Testament experience. Remember that most of the apostolic testimony is not about this life. It's about the world to come. It's about the salvation that Jesus has secured in his cross and resurrection. So, although we have a hope, a strong and powerful hope of resurrection, of a better world, we're not living in that better world. We're living in the world of Psalm 90. We're living in the world where the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven. So why are many Christian believers at this time so concerned to ask, what is God doing now? Well, I believe it is because we've forgotten that this is our existence. Actually, the coronavirus plague is a fairly small one. If you compare it to the Black Death and many other plagues that have swept through the world, the one that people often compare us with at the moment is the one that happened 100 years ago, with the great plague of what was supposed to be Spanish flu. In fact, we don't know how many people will be killed by coronavirus. I think the great fear is that, unlike the Spanish flu, it will not necessarily generate as much herd immunity. So it may be that it will run round and round. But let's hope that's not the case. But so far, at least, this is a little baby plague. This isn't the big one. There's an economic crash coming. I don't think many people realise just how unstable the financial situation of the Western world is. We are certainly going to see a crash bigger than 2008 or 1987. It may even be worse than 1929 through the 30s. But again, if you compare that to the economic disasters that have visited many generations in New Testament times, even that disaster may not be the worst. I think our real problem is that we are worried and frightened and confused. We're turning to the crazy prophets on YouTube because we have become used to living in what I call a bubble, a time of surprising extreme stability. We have lived in days of relative peace and safety. We think we are living in what we call a developed country, and that therefore that peace and stability is normal, that this is the new normal. Since for the last 80 or so years we have had relative peace and comfort, well, certainly since 1945 in this country, we assume that is the new normal. It isn't. It is the new abnormal. And trouble and all of the griefs of this life are the normal thing. Do you know, if every country was as supposedly developed as us, the whole world would be destroyed by the pollution, by the consumption that we enjoy. We've been living a life based on a ludicrous level of security and consumption. The use of fossil fuels is one example. We jet around the world, we drive cars, we ride trains, we overheat our houses in winter, and then we air condition them in summer. The Chinese have tried to crawl their way up to our standard of living, and that involved building one new coal-fired power station every week, and they're still not there yet. No, we have been living in a strange bubble. We have started wars, but we haven't experienced wars. So we started wars in Vietnam, well, that's the Americans. We've started wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and various other little wars around the world, but we've exported the suffering. We haven't suffered the wars that we've started. Again, that is so unusual. We've been like Babylon riding the beast in Revelation chapter 17. But now there's an epidemic and we can't dodge the bullet. Now it's affecting us. AIDS was a minority problem in the West, but often a majority problem in Africa. But this plague, this epidemic, is touching us all. And the economic consequences of the lockdown will touch us all. But what I want to say is, a bit like Paul writes, is it in 1 Corinthians? Nothing has come to us which is not common to humanity. In other words, trouble is normal. We live our days under God's wrath. God doesn't owe us any explanation for the current state of affairs, and there is no word from heaven. Because what is happening here is a return to normal. So the only word from heaven that we will get is the Bible, because the Bible equips us to live in a world like this as we wait for a better world that is to come. That's all I want to say today. What is God doing? He's doing what he's always been doing. What is God saying? He's saying what he's always been saying. What is our responsibility? It is to live by faith and not by sight. God bless you, keep you as you walk in faith. And goodbye.